Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling a massive historical tension. The shift of major world religions from, let's say, regulating or even accepting slavery in antiquity to their near universal condemnation today.
Right.
Our source material provides a really fascinating comparative overview, and it forces us to ask a difficult substantive question. Was this shift, this universal abolition, a genuine, substantive moral evolution? Or is the lingering shadow of trauma, what the material calls psychological enslavement and racial segregation, proof that the evolution is, well, incomplete, perhaps even superficial?
Exactly.
So for my part, I'll be arguing that the theological correction we've seen is profound and definitive.
And I'll maintain that the materials focus on persistent spiritual and emotional trauma shows that while the chains are gone legally, the underlying moral structure that once justified them hasn't been fully dismantled. The moral evolution you cite, while necessary, has been, I think, insufficient to correct that deep spiritual damage.
The evolution we observe from regulation to, universal condemnation represents a definitive and substantive moral shift. And it's guided by fundamental principles found within these faiths themselves. If we look at the historical record, particularly the Abrahamic traditions, we see a clear trajectory. They move from texts that were merely managing the reality of slavery, for instance, Leviticus 25, allowing for the permanent ownership of non-Hebrew slaves, or the instructions to slaves in Ephesians 6, which really just addressed the institution as a social fact. They moved from that to completely rejecting the premise of human ownership. The modern stance of virtually all major religions is now unequivocally aligned with human rights. And this isn't just a policy change. It's a foundational ethical pivot that, I would argue, drew on the highest ethical ideals of those traditions.
That's a compelling argument, I'll grant you, but have you considered the lasting imprint? I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the correction is substantive yet. When the material talks about psychological enslavement, it's referring to the internalization of religious hierarchies that historically defined worth based on race, leading to systemic self-doubt and, ingrained bias in institutional leadership.
Okay.
This means the centuries during which religious authorities used scripture to categorize groups, saying one group could be permanently owned, created spiritual, emotional, and moral damage that mere legal abolition has not undone. The material is explicit on this. It says, yesterday's trauma is manifesting itself today. So if the foundational damage is still actively present in society, then how can the moral correction be considered complete?
Well, let's focus on that pivot point then, the distinction between regulation and wholesale condemnation, because that is where I think the definitive moral victory lies. You seem to be viewing the regulatory passages solely as endorsements, but in ancient contexts, those scriptural regulations, like, say, the Exodus mandate to free Hebrew slaves after 6 years, or the Islamic encouragement of manumission as a virtuous act, cited in Quran 24:33, they introduced limitations on a pre-existing brutal system. Limitations, yes, but
These limitations were ethical friction points, and the fact that many of these faiths eventually used those same ethical seeds to overturn the entire institution shows the doctrine corrected itself according to its own highest internal logic.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. You're confusing damage control with genuine moral clarity. If a faith's foundational texts allowed for the permanent ownership of non-adherents, which Leviticus 25 clearly did, well, then those texts created a fundamental distinction between groups rooted in religious legality. That distinction provided the religious scaffolding for the exploitation that later became the catastrophic racialized slavery we are discussing, particularly impacting people of African descent.
Right. It means the catastrophe wasn't accidental. It was religiously enabled. So for you to call the eventual global condemnation a moral triumph kind of minimizes the initial moral failure of accepting human ownership in the first place. It was an overdue ethical admission, not a triumph.
But if the initial acceptance was a reflection of the social norms of antiquity, the subsequent condemnation represents a conscious choice to prioritize theological idealism over societal convenience. We have to recognize the immense intellectual and theological heavy lifting required to reinterpret foundational texts and overturn centuries of embedded practice. The sheer breadth of the modern consensus, from traditions that had extensive scriptural regulation to those like Buddhism and Sikhism that inherently emphasized equality and non-harm, that demonstrates a universal alignment with human dignity. That breadth is the substance of the moral correction.
That breadth is acknowledged, sure, but we have to interrogate the material's assertion that religions still contain the justification for segregation and psychological harm. When we look at how this manifests today, we're often talking about the selective application of core theological concepts, like the idea that humanity reflects the divine, the imago Dei. Historically, religious institutions excluded enslaved peoples from that full divine reflection, treating them with a destructive paternalism rather than, genuine spiritual equality.
Okay, I see your point.
That theological legacy means that today, when the material asserts that things are still spiritually, emotionally, morally, and psychologically the same, it's because those spiritual categories of worth and unworth created by religious acceptance of slavery, they haven't been fully dismantled in the collective consciousness, not for the descendants of the enslaved or the descendants of the enslavers. If the evolution was truly complete, why hasn't this spiritual stasis dissolved?
I acknowledge completely that religious frameworks were horrifically misused to enforce this destructive paternalism, creating lasting psychological categories. That is undeniable. But framing the persistence of these social scars as a failure of current theology misidentifies the nature of the problem.
How so?
We are seeing a historical wound that requires long-term societal healing, not a continuing flaw in the doctrine. Today, the doctrinal position of nearly every major religion is abolitionist and oriented toward human rights. If the justification were still inherent, we wouldn't see institutions pouring massive resources into reconciliation efforts, driven explicitly by their modern ethical mandates. The current failure to eradicate segregation is a failure of human and institutional follow-through, a sociological problem inherited from the past, not a flaw in the Reformed doctrine itself, which has unequivocally excised the justification for ownership.
I think you're drawing too sharp a line there between sociology and theology. The material compels us to examine the specific trauma affecting people of African descent. For them, the historical silence or the early regulation was far from benign. I mean, consider those faiths you mentioned, like Taoism or Confucianism. While they didn't offer explicit religious condemnation in their texts, their deep existence in societies where slavery thrived meant they offered no religious counter-narrative. They effectively gave tacit moral consents to the practice. So the effectiveness of the moral correction, it must be measured by the successful healing of the victims, not merely by the declaration of the perpetrator's reform. If the internal categories created by centuries of religious allowance are still driving modern segregation, if people still feel that spiritual immobility, then the moral correction hasn't reached its intended spiritual depth.
But to insist that the eradication of complex inherited trauma must happen concurrently with a theological reform, that is setting an unhistorical standard. The movement from acceptance to alignment with fundamental human rights represents an undeniable and frankly monumental trajectory of moral improvement. To ignore that massive internal shift, a shift that required reinterpreting scripture and overturning centuries of social acceptance, is to fundamentally misunderstand religious history. The theological structures have reformed themselves.
But have they?
When the material says that trauma is manifesting today, it highlights the profound residual effects which is crucial for understanding the work of reconciliation. But it does not logically conclude that the justification for ownership is still contained within the current dominant theological frameworks. The systems have reformed themselves. The societal institutions, sadly, are slower and more resistant to change.
But the lasting psychological categories that define the slave, the master, and the appropriate relationship between them were explicitly founded on religious interpretation. It's the use of religious texts to categorize worth that created the deep spiritual debt we are discussing. We have to hold the theological change accountable for the resulting spiritual debt.
We must distinguish between the historical abuse of religious frameworks and the definitive modern correction of the frameworks themselves.
And we must distinguish between legal and formal correction and actual spiritual remediation.
So, in summarizing my position, the evidence is overwhelming. Religious institutions have definitively moved away from scriptural acceptance and regulation to a modern, universal, moral rejection of slavery. This evolution is historically significant and represents genuine, substantive moral progress within their doctrines, aligning them with the highest ideals of human dignity. The condemnation is absolute, and the theology itself is, I believe, no longer the root of the problem.
And in summarizing mine, while legal and formal condemnation is acknowledged, the deepest measure of moral evolution must be the successful healing of the associated spiritual injury and the elimination of the structures that facilitate psychological enslavement referenced in the material. Until the observation that things are still spiritually, emotionally, morally, and psychologically the same for many is invalidated, the moral evolution remains incomplete. I think we are confusing a necessary retreat from injustice with a full spiritual triumph over it.
Ultimately, what we're grappling with here is the difference between writing a new rule, which was necessary and difficult, and actually healing the deep-seated damage it caused. The formal theological position is fixed, but the ethical mandate for sociological and spiritual reconciliation clearly continues.
Indeed, the material forces us to explore further how theological frameworks, once used to regulate or accept injustice, continue to cast a long shadow, and it demands that we scrutinize the effectiveness of current reforms in addressing historical spiritual injury. There is clearly much more to explore regarding the long-term impact of these historical theological positions.